Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today I found a very interesting video that was made by the British Museum where they talk about Roman legionaries, and I thought I would share it with you, maybe provide a little commentary, a little bit of a reaction. So let's go.
Legion is an exhibition unique in its scope. We follow the journey of one Roman citizen in his quest to
Oh,
become...
look at that. I mean, recently I spent some time at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York as I went there with my wife. Already, of course, it's a different museum, clearly, but there are lots of similarities. There is really, really good armor that you can find there. And always seeing the real stuff, it's so immersive for me, because at the end of the day you can imagine these things, you see replicas, you wear the replicas in my case as a reenactor, but then again when you see the originals, it's always like I'm always blown away by the idea that what we're seeing now, this I think is kind of a late imperial italic helmet with these fragments of lorica segmentata and a manica which by the color appears to be bronze possibly. All of these things were actually literally the real deal, and they were worn by real soldiers. I think I see a brass corlus in the back as a type of helmet, so this really always blows my mind. So, and by the way, this is the life of an extraordinary Roman soldier, curator's tour of Legion life in the Roman army.
a legionary and belong to one of the world's most infamous fighting forces.
How is it infamous though? Famous, not infamous. Not infamous. Glory to Rome. I don't know why he's saying infamous. That's really weird.
Claudius Terentianus was a Roman soldier in the beginning of the 2nd century. The surviving letters he sent home...
All right, beginning of the 2nd century, so of course we are still in the Principate, early Roman Empire, but not too early. So it's an interesting position, and we are looking at actual original letters. There aren't that many. I think they're going to mention this. I'm going to get ahead of myself. Windolanda, the tablets of Windolanda are also interesting usually when it comes to this, and they're giving us a little bit of an everyday life commentary to the life of a Roman legionary, particularly those that were deployed a little bit far away from home, such as in Britannia. But yeah, let's see.
...are as enlightening as they are rare. In Roman history, we have a tendency to focus on the aristocracy, the important people, and the world-changing events.
Oh my gosh, look at that. Let me go back. And by the way, she does have a point. That is correct. That is gorgeous. Of course, this is a lorica segmentata. We all know that. By the looks of it, I think this is a core bridge type A, because if you look at here, there is a mechanism that connects the pectoral plates to these bands that constitute the chest protector with something that would have been a leather strap, whereas the way I see it, because I see a little bit of the buckle here. So I think this is a core bridge type A. I could be wrong, but that's what I think, and I find it fascinating to see that normally, because of the different material that they were made of, the buckles and the hinges tend to be better preserved than the actual bands, because the bands are made of iron, sometimes low carbon steel, sometimes they're sandwiched, so they have an inside of iron and an outside of steel. Sometimes that happens, whereas the hinges and the brass decorations and of course the buckles are once again some forms of copper. Sometimes it's pure copper, sometimes it can be brass, and so yeah, they usually have a different resistance to corrosion because of the natural patina that forms on anything that is copper related.
But in Legion, we illuminate the day-to-day experiences of the soldiers and those around
Oh,
them.
look at, oh my gosh, this is good. This is good. Look at this is a udones, so it's a pair of socks, we could say, that Romans wore usually in the cold countries. It kind of depends. They would all have had it. But they don't always wear it. Kind of depends on the climate and the weather, of course. And then after that, we had the marvelous scutum, the Dura Europos, which I believe is the only shield in this condition that we have from the period, and it's also the basis by which that we use to create all other types of Roman imperial rectangular shields. I've seen this firsthand because I was actually very lucky a few years ago to have been at the Met in New York once again. I kind of go periodically, but on that specific time, I didn't even know, but they had moved this shield from, I believe it's in the British Museum, of course, they had moved it to America for just a few weeks, and I just so happened to, as I was walking around looking at the helmets, I'm like, hold on a minute, that's Dura Europos. Oh my gosh. So we took so much footage, we looked at it from every angle, but it is important to say one thing. First of all, the conditions that you see, well, this is a meticulous work of reconstruction in the sense that the shield was actually smashed when they found it. I think it was under some debris, and so it was smashed, and they had to kind of put it together and rebuild it together. But it is still impressive to see the resilience of the pigment, for example. Of course, this would have probably been brighter than this, not as bright as some of the chemical modern shields, the way they are painted, but still probably would have been brighter than this. When we look at pigment and historical pigment and the way it goes and the way it reacts to time, which is of course a very important factor when it comes to preservation of ancient art, whether it be the painting job over a shield or some murals that are painted. The way the constituents of said paints react to time, the weather, and the exposure to the elements really varies. And sometimes I hear people sort of oversimplifying it a bit too much and saying, well, your paint always fades. But that's not true. In fact, sometimes it does. And I think this is one of those cases where I do believe, I mean, I would have to see a chemical analysis if they have ever done any of those, but I would have to see that before I can say it confidently. But in my experience, whenever I look at something, this does appear as the sort of paint or pigment that probably would have been darker in period. With that being said, if you look at, for example, the tomb of Seti I, then there is a whole study done by the University of Florence that demonstrated without any shade of doubt that that paint was in fact lighter in period and it darkened over time. And in fact, one of the pharaohs and the queen, their hair is now black, but it used to be blue. And there are other situations like that where absolutely pigment may, depending on a lot of factors, get darker with time. It's an important thing that I wanted to sort of underline. I'm going to talk a lot today.
The life of a Roman soldier.
It's another one. This is clearly an officer, probably a centurion. Note that he's wearing his sword or his gladius on the left. Normally regular soldiers, regular legionaries would be wearing it on the right because it makes it easier to draw while you are maintaining your left hand to, close the line of defense here with your shield. If your sword, like in this case, was on the left and you have to draw it, you have to move the shield away, and that's not always a great thing. But usually officers are kind of the exception to that, and he's wearing what appears to be a lorica hamata.
Wasn't easy, full of violence and hardship, and death from battle or disease was likely. But the rewards of that service were potentially life-changing. So, what did it take to become part of the Roman army?
I hope the music is not copyrighted.
I beg you, Father, if it meets with your approval, to send me from there military sandals and a pair of felt socks.
Okay, so we are now reading directly from the letter. That's very interesting. One thing I want to say, there are lots of different materials. In this case, he's mentioning felt. That's not the only material that was used. Sometimes they used rabbit skins. Sometimes they used cow or pig skin. Of course, wool was a thing. Cotton was a thing, but it was a bit more expensive actually in period. So kind of not as expensive as silk, but definitely more expensive than wool, kind of depending on the situation. The way certain materials feel on the skin is really conducive to some choices made by the ancients. For instance, even talking about something medieval, this arming doublet that I'm wearing, even though the outside is a little more rough, the inside is hemp. And I have to say, this is pretty nice to wear, and I wear it pretty much every day. And also my brigandine, outside is hand-spun silk velvet, but the inside is once again hemp. So it's interesting how certain materials were chosen also because of the way they felt in contact with the body. And that's one of the main misconceptions when it comes to armor as well and helmets, that people think that you just have the metal directly, like even with a breastplate in games, it's often like this, the breastplate, the metal is directly in contact with the skin. That wasn't a thing. Ancient people, medieval people, they are still humans, and they want to be comfortable when they're wearing their gear, particularly something that they wear every day.
I was ordered to take the oath.
So you want to join the Roman army, but would you be able to get in? Not everyone could join the Roman army.
Yeah, that's true. They have height requirements. They change depending on the period. You have to be a Roman citizen if you want to be part of the actual citizen soldiers.
The first, perhaps simplest requirement was height, and that was 5'10" in Roman feet. This is slightly different to what it is today, but it would have been...
Yes, she's saying 172. I think that's correct because, of course, Roman feet are not the same as modern feet. So 5'10" in Roman feet. It's probably 5'8", I want to say, modern feet. I'm always confused with feet. But anyways, I'm 175, 76, depending on the day. So I would have been okay to become a Roman legionary.
About 172 centimeters. You had to be under the age of 35. However, as long as you met the height requirement, you could be as young as, say, 13 and still join the Roman army. As well as these two requirements, you also needed a good letter of recommendation. Now, this would be a letter from someone recommending you to a position in the Roman army.
If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.
This is one of the Vindolanda tablets, and it's actually a letter of recommendation. It's a letter written by a man named Carus to Flavius Cerealis, the commander at Vindolanda, and he's recommending a soldier for a position at Carlisle. The Roman army needed to know that their recruits and future soldiers were up to the task, and letters of recommendation were a really great way of ensuring that this would happen. Now, Terentianus, as a Roman citizen, expected to join the elite legions. That's certainly what he wanted. But he fell short with his letter of recommendation. He couldn't get a good enough one. Instead, he got a letter written by a couple of his friends that got him into the auxiliary marines. Not exactly what he wanted.
Oh, that's very interesting. You know, whenever you mention the Marines, I can't help but remember Vegetius, particularly also because we're talking about British Isles. I can't help but remember Vegetius and how he mentions that the Roman military, specifically the navy in Britannia, would wear blue. He specifically calls it Venetian blue, and that would be the same for the shields, would be the same for the sails of their boats, and they did it as a form of early tactical camouflage because it would make it harder for them to be identified when they are at sea. Just something interesting. So probably would be wearing blue. I also have a blue shield. Maybe I should show it.
Not exactly what he wanted. Hopeful Roman soldiers would start as recruits, wouldn't become immediate soldiers. They had to go through quite grueling training. Objects like these would have been used in that training. A wooden target in the shape of an individual, a person, and this wooden sword. You can see perhaps on the surface of this target.
That's the rudis. It's the training sword, yes.
Target also the damage that might have been caused by practiced swords. This skull comes from the fort at Vindolanda, and it was probably used as target practice. If you look closely, the holes are square in shape. This matches the bolts used in Roman bolt shooters. This coin shows us the moment of a Roman soldier taking his oath, or the sacramentum as it was called. We don't know much about the Roman military.
I think that one is a pretty famous coin. I've seen it.
This is one of the very few depictions we have of it. It shows two soldiers with one recruit kneeling in the middle. The recruit has a piglet, and the two soldiers have their swords on it. This piglet may have been sacrificed during the taking of the oath.
Fascinating. I like that you have Roma written at the bottom.
At this point, you're swearing yourself to the army. Now, even if you're a citizen protected by Roman law, in this moment, you're swearing away those rights, which means that were you to desert or somehow fail in your obligations, they would have the right to punish you as they saw fit. This is a really significant moment in every soldier's life, and Terentianus writes about it. And when he does, he says he was ordered to take the oath.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And the next time I go to Britain, I have to go to this British. I don't think I've ever been to the British Museum.
Both Calibal and Diapistus have enlisted in the Augustan fleet of Alexandria. No one has reckoned up the chances of their lives. I went by boat, and with their help I enlisted in the fleet, lest I seem to you to wander like a fugitive, lured on by bitter hope.
So now you're in the army, but where do you fit in? If you were a Roman citizen, you would normally want to join the Roman legions. Better pay, better conditions.
Oh my gosh, I should make a dedicated video to pay in the Roman legion because it very much differentiated. It changed depending on your rank. I do have a video dedicated to Roman military ranks, by the way, link in the description. The pay would change not only depending on what rank you had, what position you had, what jobs you were doing, but also depending on the era, because several emperors actually did increase the pay of their legionaries, and then apart from the pay, you also had access or rights towards certain parts of the loot. So there is a lot to say about Roman pay. I wonder if he's going to mention some of that.
If you were a non-Roman citizen, you still had the option of joining the auxiliary support services. One of these auxiliary units was the Roman Marines, and this is the one that Terentianus joined. While he was a Marine, Terentianus hated it. At one point he rails, "They paid no more attention to me than a sponge on a stick," the Roman form of toilet paper.
Probably that's not because he was in the Marine, but because he was a recruit, I imagine. Personally, as an ex-Navy guy, I sympathize.
He has his equipment nicked by his own officers. While he's in sick bay, he then has his bedding stolen. A miserable time all round. Claudius Terentianus could read and write. This is a rare skill in antiquity.
Yeah, that actually qualifies him to become an officer because, for example, an optio, chosen soldier that would constituted the under officer of a, for example, centurion, had as a requirement had to be able to read and write. And so if you couldn't read and write, then you couldn't sort of rank up, if you will. So it's good for him.
With the ability to read and write, you could read and write orders, and this was the key to getting promoted roles in the Roman army. A good promoted role might be the standard bearer. This was a man on double the pay of an ordinary soldier.
Very honourable position.
This tombstone shows Imaginifer. He holds the imago, the image of a bust of the emperor. In his other hand, you can see he has a scroll. He's telling us he can read and write.
Yeah, that's exactly, I was about to say, that's a symbol just to show us I can read and write.
An important function of promoted men. Standard bearers held the standards of either the regiment or the particular century to which they belonged. You had to lead from the front, so you had to be brave. You had to be able to read and write, of course, as all promoted men did, but you also had to be numerate because Roman standard bearers kept the pay and the accounts for their men. The top position for a commoner would be the role of centurion, commander of a century. We have one example of a centurion who managed to become...
Note that he has some protection for the legs as well, and sometimes this is both, but oftentimes it's only one of the two, and when that's the case, it's the left leg, because at the end of the day, when you're fighting and you're getting ready to fight as a Roman, then you usually... but not just as a Roman, but in general, right-handed people tend to put the left in front as they're getting ready to fight, and therefore the left is always the part that is more armored. And this happens both in classical antiquity, and it also happens, of course, in the medieval period. Now, would there have been left-handed Roman legionaries? Yes. Perhaps I could make a dedicated video on the concept of being left-handed through the ages. But when it comes to Roman military, even if you were left-handed, you would have been ordered to learn to use the sword with the right and the shield with the left, regardless of you being left-handed. So there is that.
A centurion, by vote of the legion from being a standard bearer, he must have been able to show his bravery in the face of battle. It was a position of high responsibility and power. Centurion was paid, to start with, 15 times the wages of an ordinary soldier. He was very valued in the Roman army.
An interesting thing to say about centurion is, of course, a centurion is in command of a century, and normally when we think of the word century, we think of 100 men, and that is somewhat correct, but it kind of depends once again on which era of the Roman Empire, and even before that the Republic and all that, Manipular legions, because at the end of the day, oftentimes a century is 80 fighting men and 20 servants. So you're really leading, yes, you're leading 100 men, but you're leading 80 soldiers. Now, once again, these numbers change. You also have cohorts that are double strength, and then therefore a centurion, you can have two centurions, but one is going to be a leading centurion. It's complicated. But in general, yes, a century is 80 to 100 men, but the exact number will depend on whether we're talking about early Roman Republic or the Republican army, late Roman Republican army, Imperial Rome, etc.
One role that would tempt even legionaries was the role of cavalry. The cavalry was one of the most glamorous roles in the Roman army, and the chance to show off came with the cavalry sports, a very specialist form of cavalry parade. It included standards like this: unique survival, the Draco of Koblenz. This Draco comes from the fortress of Niederbiber on the Rhineland frontier. It
Fascinating. I hope they show some masks as well.
dates to the late 2nd century or early 3rd century AD. It's the only one that's ever been found. The Draco would be mounted on a pole. The head's hollow, so it would make a whistling sound as the rider rode along. It was attached to a windsock that billowed out like a fearsome tail.
I wish you told us what it's made of, but by the looks of it, it appears to be bronze. Now, I wanted to look at something. Of course, the green part is the patina that bronze develops. Now, it's not always green. It kind of depends on, once again, on the constituent of the alloy, but very commonly it's green. In fact, this happens with copper as well. One of the reasons why the Statue of Liberty looks green is because of the patina. Originally, it would have looked more like a polished brown. Now, look at these parts, however. There are some areas where you can see that the patina hasn't formed, and we can still see the original color of the bronze, and it's yellow. Are you noticing that? Now I have a whole dedicated video to this. Let me show you. And it's this one here. Most of you will get this wrong. And it talks about all the different varieties of bronze and how they looked. Because of course the color of the alloy will strongly depend. And there are so many different types of bronze. Arsenical bronze, tin bronze, so many different types that you have many different versions. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the classical period, I think a good representation of bronze would be a dull gold color when it comes to both spears, arrowheads, helmets, and pieces of armor, not necessarily statues.
Originally gilded, this is a unique example surviving from the Rhine.
Although then again, now he's saying it's gilded, so it's possible that that's why we have this color. But there are examples where we do see there is a vase. My point is still valid. There is a vase amphora that we find at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and it's bronze, but it's yellow, and you can see that.
Land. The Draco standard, interestingly, was adopted from Rome's enemies, the Sarmatians. It's very much emblematic of the Roman practice of incorporating the ideas, the symbols of the enemy, and making them their own.
I ask and beg you, Father, to send to me a battle sword, a pickaxe, a grappling iron, 2 of the best spears attainable, a cloak of beaver skin, and a girdled tunic, together
That's a lot of money.
with my trousers, so that I may have them. I wore out my tunic before I entered the service, and my trousers were laid away new.
Okay, so you found your place in the army. How do you get your...
I wish you would provide some commentary on the contents of the letter. Isn't it interesting the way he worded it? Of course, this is in translation, but isn't it interesting? I want this are all the things that I want so that I may have them. Something you could say, it's kind of obvious, of course, so you may have them, but I like the thought process, very reminiscent of Latin. The idea that oftentimes Latin puts also the verbs at the end, so at the end of the day, the whole structure of the thought capability, the thought capacity, the way they think the world, because language does influence the way you experience and vision the world, absolutely. So I found that little small thing to be very interesting. And at the end of the day, he's asking for a lot of things. I find it curious that, of course, he is already asking for new tunics, and they need to be sent all the way from, I imagine, Italia, probably, so that's going to take some time. But the Romans did have a very effective postal service, so there is that.
There were 3 ways to get your equipment. The easiest way that Terentianus found was to request it from home. He was, after all, from a military family. Otherwise, soldiers would have to purchase their equipment from the armourer, but at the end of service they could sell it back and recoup their deposit. So there was also a very strong second-hand market.
Yeah, seed money.
And we have helmets that have not just 1 or 2 owners' names inscribed on them, but 3, even 4, suggesting a very lengthy period of service. This example shows what a legionary might have looked like towards the end of the 2nd century. He has a cuirass, a segmental cuirass. He also has protection extended to the sword arm, a manica or armoured sleeve. It looks very gladiatorial, and in fact it probably is borrowed from gladiator equipment.
Very much so, yes. Sometimes like heavily armoured gladiators such as the Murmillo, but I think sometimes even the Traix use that kind of manica protection.
The helmet is still gleaming from the Rhine, and it's got extra strips on the bowl of the helmet and a very wide...
Yeah, the extra strip is of course to deflect the blow and also provide a better version, a better way of protecting it, because if you have the extra strip here and that blow comes directly, it disperses the force in a different way. It's very, very ingenious design.
Neck guard. Typical equipment for a legionary is this pilum, or armour-piercing javelin. It would be thrown at the enemy, hopefully piercing the shield and reaching the defender behind it. He is shown with a very late period gladius or short sword. This is a particular type known as a ring pommel sword, and it's virtually the last era when legionaries carried short swords.
I'm not a huge fan when historians and archaeologists called Roman gladi, and even more so this one, a late one, short swords, because at the end of the day, for their period, they're not short swords, they are swords. I mean, when we imagine the word short sword, particularly in the context of like D&D or games, you think, well, there is a short sword, that's a shorter version. You have the long sword, it's a longer one. You have got arming swords, which kind of a medium in between. You have a bastard swords. So you have all sorts range of options, and you choose the short one. In the case of the classical period, whether it be the Egyptians, whether it be the Greeks, whether it be the Romans, that is a sword. It's a regular, in fact, type of sword, and anything longer than that would have been the exception. So that's a regular sword. And at the end of the day, when you take a gladius, whether it be a Mainz gladius or even a Pompeii, which tend to be a little shorter, it's still as long as my arm, almost, including, of course, the hilt. So I've never been a huge fan of calling it a short sword. I would just call it a sword, because for its time, it's regular in size.
The other piece of equipment vital for heavy infantry legionaries was the scutum, or long shield. This one in particular is the only surviving example of Dura Europus on the Euphrates frontier.
Oh, I can see a mask. I could see a mask on the back. Look at that. Can you see it? Oh my gosh, cavalry masks are so good when they're well made. And of course, these are well made. Sometimes they were even silver plated. Can you imagine that? Here you can see the sort of briefcase grip of the shield, which I believe has been recreated. I don't know if that's original, to be honest.
By the dry environment of the Syrian desert. The main feature you can see is the wonderful painted decoration.
That is absolutely one of the main features. Another thing that I personally like is the fact that how it has a rim, but in this case it's not a metal rim. It is mostly ubiquitous in the reenactment field. Maybe now it's been changing for the last few years. But yeah, the rim that you see here is rawhide. And so that's why I really very much like shields that also provide this option in the reenactment field. And also you see symbols here. Of course, this has nothing to do with 1940s Germany. Also because it's facing the other way. This is a different symbol, which is a completely different connotation, usually has to do with bandful.
This is painted on leather on top of plywood with a bronze binding. Images include victories, a Roman eagle, and...
Yeah, and generally speaking, whenever we see shields, whether it be in the classical period, in the medieval period, they're always covered. On the majority of cases, they're covered. Even Norse shields are covered. So they can be covered in leather, like in this case. They can be covered in linen. They can be covered in parchment and then being gessoed over. It's very rare, in my experience, to have a shield that just has the naked planks like you see in the movies and games. And instead, in the majority of cases, they would be covered with another material that also works as a binding element. Because if you think about it, if you manage to smash a shield and the planks crack, at least it's not going to completely disassemble if it's still held together by several layers. It just makes sense. And the fact that if you notice, he said plywood, this might surprise some of you, but the Romans did absolutely have access to plywood. And even though sometimes you might think it's more of a modern thing, it isn't. The Romans had it. And in the way they constructed these shields, oftentimes, since they have 3 different layers of plywood, and these are oriented differently. So first layer, second layer is oriented this way, and third layer is oriented that way, and that makes it a lot more resistant to penetration and cutting.
Probably a regimental symbol of a lion. In the corners are 4 swastikas. In antiquity, this was simply a symbol of good luck. Conservators preserved it, trying to maintain as much as possible of the painted surface, so it is slightly more curled than it would have been in real life. Also, it must have been a spare part. It lacks the nail holes needed for the boss, the metal plate that would have protected the hand that gripped the shield in the middle.
Very interesting. I didn't know that. That's an interesting piece of information that he added. So it was basically disassembled. It wasn't ready. Well, it could be a spare part, as you say, or it could also be that that's how they kept them in winter, for example, which wasn't campaign. Who knows?
The boss next to it was found in the Tyne. It's from the 2nd century AD, and it belongs to a soldier called Dubitatus. The boss protects the hand holding the shield, but it could be used as a kind of punch in its own offensive way.
Anything can, I'd like to underline. I can use this can in an offensive way. So I find it funny when archaeologists and historians point out, and you could hit someone with a shield. I'm like, yeah, you can hit someone with your helmet. Take it off and smash it in the head. So it's not that wow, revealing thing that you can punch with a shield. I mean, yeah.
We're extremely fortunate in this exhibition to have what is the finest preserved and the earliest example of a Roman legionary's body armour or cuirass. This example turned up in excavation on a battlefield in 2014, and after 4 years of conservation, it's been returned to absolutely stunning condition. It's so well preserved, you can see that some of the buckles have been opened. Chemical analysis of the soil inside the cuirass suggests that somebody died inside.
Oh, this is fascinating.
And perhaps these buckles have been opened to plunge in the final knife blow. This object reminds us of the hazards of being a Roman soldier. The risk of violence combined with disease and illness.
Oh yeah, he had disease, absolutely. For example, what happened in the Roman province of Egypt, in the, I think it was in the first century, yes, it was in the first century when there was an outbreak of infectious disease that actually killed quite a few Roman soldiers. So absolutely, we have these mentions in the sources. Although then again, of course, that could happen also if you weren't in the military. In fact, I'm going to say something strange now. You know how he says Roman soldier, very risky one, but then again, you are still inside one of the most powerful professional armies in the world. So at the end of the day, it is dangerous, but it's less dangerous than just being a farmer who gets attacked because maybe you're somewhere outside in the borders and then your area gets invaded. In that case, I would rather be a Roman soldier. So risk is an interesting element because it really depends. Risk doesn't work in a vacuum, but it depends on the context on where you are. And being inside the Roman army, it is risky, but depending on what you're comparing it to, it might be a certain level of risk that people could be very well ready to accept.
This made life as a Roman soldier a very risky one. In AD 115, Trentianus himself faced a revolt of his own, the Jewish diaspora revolt, which spreads to Alexandria. And he talks about putting down the anarchy and the uproar of the city. He himself was wounded.
He sent me word about a woman. With my consent, he was buying one for me. As far back as 2 years ago, I would have taken a woman into my house, but I did not permit myself, nor do I permit myself to take anyone without your approval. If you remain steadfast in refusal the rest of your life, I shall do without my woman. If not, the woman whom you reprove is also the one whom I also want.
Now, as a Roman soldier...
That was a very, very interesting, very intriguing. Look how the way we experience the world and the way we consider what's socially acceptable and also it's so interesting. So he's talking about buying a woman, which already in our time we would be frowning upon, and yet he doesn't even flicker about that. The problem is, but does my father, I imagine he's writing, approve of that? Look, so basically it's a little bit of a virtual signaling, I imagine, but not so much, not in the negative sense. But it's interesting how to this Roman, that's not the part. The part that we're talking about is, but my father has to approve it. Fascinating.
If you've survived battle, how might your downtime look? Not every soldier would have faced the dangers of battle, but almost all soldiers would have known the day-to-day life of living in a Roman fort.
Good
Roman
point.
forts were like miniature towns built for Roman soldiers to live in. They were permanent structures built in areas where the Romans felt they needed to maintain a presence.
Yeah, this looks like a winter one.
Military communities weren't just made up of Roman soldiers. The soldiers themselves had families, wives and children. Roman soldiers weren't officially allowed to marry unless they were officers or held certain positions, but we know that they did. They had women who they considered their wives and wrote to their families referring to them as their wives, and they had children who they wanted to provide for. Now, Trentianus writes home asking for permission to buy a woman. This would be a concubine, and so he needs permission to bring a woman into his household. One of the most famous women from a military community in Britain is Regina. This is her tombstone, erected by her husband, a man named Barytes, who was...
It's kind of funny, for a moment I thought she said vagina. I mean, that is the word for scabbard or a sheath for a sword. So, I mean...
The Romans. Now, Regina's story is a little bit more complicated than that. She was his wife. She was actually initially his concubine, which is to say, an enslaved woman. Eventually, he freed her and married her. We don't know the context for that, and we don't know how much choice she will have had in that decision. But it gives us an interesting insight into the dynamic of their relationship. This is an incredibly elaborate tombstone, and Regina is shown as a very elegant, very Roman woman. But one of the more interesting aspects of this tombstone is the inscriptions at the bottom. Inside a square, as you'd expect, is an inscription written in Latin, but beneath it is the added inscription in Aramaic.
Oh, so she was Semitic.
The original language of her husband, Barytes.
Oh, he was.
A final lament for his wife that says, Regina, the freed woman of Barytes, alas. Soldiers were recruited from many different areas of the Roman Empire, so many of them would have been bilingual, and we expect that probably their children will have been bilingual too. Terentianus himself writes in both Latin and Ancient Greek, a common language spoken in Egypt.
Yeah, also because Greek was the language of the learned, so it kind of reflects the allure that a modern day common language such as English does, but also like maybe French up to, I want to say, the late 1800s and even early 20th century. So it's kind of a fact that he speaks Greek might have a social connotation.
Forts were also places where soldiers spent a lot of their free time, and they loved playing games. This extraordinary object is a bronze dice tower. Now, this was used for rolling dice. You drop the dice at the
That's
top
incredible. They look so modern.
of the tower, and there are some levels inside the tower that would force the dice to roll. This was fun for when you're just rolling dice, but it was actually a very useful device as well, because it's an anti-cheating device. Now, we know that the Romans love to play games, and they love to gamble. But we also know that quite a lot of cheating went on. We found loaded dice that almost always roll sixes. This device makes sure that doesn't happen. On the front of the dice tower, there's an
But to be honest, if it's loaded dice, how is that gonna be prevented? But I mean, I thought that you meant that someone had a way to, like, you know, roll the cast the dice that was kind of weird, and so they do it there. How does a loaded? Maybe it wouldn't. You mean they wouldn't go down? I wish you would have expanded a bit on that.
inscription. It says, Pictos victos hostes deleta ludite securiter, which means the Picts have been defeated, all hostiles are vanquished, now use me in safety. One of the most famous Vindolanda tablets depicts a very ordinary moment in people's lives, which might surprise you. This is a birthday party invitation, and in fact, probably the oldest birthday party invitation in the world.
Fascinating.
It's an invitation from a woman named Claudia Severa to her friend Lepidina to celebrate her birthday on the 11th of September. Though most of the invitation will have been written by a scribe, at the end there's a final message that's written by Claudia Severa herself. This makes it the oldest known female handwriting in Britain. On the invite, Claudia Severa writes, I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper and hail.
Beautiful.
Receive with my recommendation the discharged soldier Terentianus who brings you this letter, and let him know what sort
Okay, so they're going to talk about retirement. I mean, retirement might be good for a dedicated video discussing how retirement works for Roman soldiers, and so perhaps I'll keep this to use as an element to then go deeper perhaps and discuss Roman legionary retirement. But then again, this was fantastic. I've been really enjoying this video, so absolutely go check it out, and I'll provide clearly a link in the description if you want to do so. And of course I thank the British Museum for having shared this. This is really good, and I thank each and every single one of you for watching this all the way up to the end. So I hope to see you again for my next daily upload, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.